Have you ever wondered why millionaires seem to live in a completely different financial reality than the rest of us? I'm talking about that mysterious shift where money stops being something you chase and starts being something that works for you. Well, there's actually a specific threshold where this transformation happens, and it's not what most people think. My name is Nick, and I've spent years studying wealth building patterns, watching people cross financial milestones, and analyzing what actually changes when your investment portfolio hits certain numbers. And what I've discovered might completely change how you think about building wealth. Because there's something fundamentally different that happens when you reach $1 million invested. Not earned, not in net worth, but actually invested and working for you. Most people think wealth building is linear. They imagine that having $200,000 is just twice as good as having $100,000, and that $1 million is simply 10 times better than $100,000. But that's not how money actually works at scale. There are specific thresholds where the rules of the game completely change, and $1 million represents the most important threshold most people will ever cross. Here's what's really happening that nobody talks about. When you hit $1 million invested, you don't just have more money, you literally become a different type of person in the economic system. You transform from being someone who trades time for money into someone who owns capital that generates income. And this isn't just a philosophical difference. It's a mathematical reality that changes everything about how you live, work, and think about risk. Let me show you exactly what I mean with some numbers that will probably shock you. When you have $10,000 invested earning a 7% annual return, that generates about $700 per year in passive income. Nice, but not exactly life-changing. When you have $50,000 invested, you're looking at around $3,500 annually. Again, helpful, but you're still completely dependent on your job for survival. But here's where the math becomes absolutely unfair in your favor. $1 million at that same 7% return generates $70,000 per year without you lifting a finger. $70,000. That's more than many people earn at their full-time jobs, and it requires 0 hours of your time, 0 commute, 0 dealing with difficult bosses or workplace drama. Think about what this means in practical terms. The average American household spends about $67,000 per year according to recent data. So with $1 million invested, your money isn't just contributing to your lifestyle, it's potentially funding your entire lifestyle. Your investments become your employee, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, generating income while you sleep, while you travel, while you spend time with family, while you pursue hobbies or passions. This is the first wealth threshold where capital starts outperforming labor for most people. And once you cross this line, everything about your relationship with money fundamentally shifts. You stop being a saver and become a capital owner. These might sound like similar concepts, but they're completely different psychological and practical realities. When you're a saver, you're still thinking in terms of accumulating money. Every dollar matters because you're building towards something. You're focused on growth, on adding more to the pile, on reaching the next milestone. Your financial strategy is all about offense, constantly looking for ways to earn more and save more. But when you become a capital owner with significant invested assets, your entire mindset shifts to preservation and optimization. You're no longer trying to get rich, you're trying to stay rich. And this requires a completely different set of skills, strategies, and psychological frameworks. The math alone is enough to change your entire perspective on risk. When you have $20,000 invested, a 10% market drop costs you $2,000. That stings, but it's recoverable. When you have $1 million invested, that same 10% drop costs you $100,000. Suddenly, market volatility isn't just numbers on a screen. It's real money that could fund multiple years of living expenses. But here's the fascinating part that most people don't understand until they experience it themselves. Once you have significant capital invested, market downturns stop feeling like disasters and start feeling like opportunities. When you have $1 million generating income, You have the financial cushion to weather temporary storms. More importantly, you have the capital to take advantage of situations that require money up front. This is where the wealthy really separate themselves from everyone else. They use market downturns to buy more assets at discounted prices. They have the resources to invest in opportunities that require substantial capital. They can afford to take calculated risks that could multiply their wealth because they already have enough to maintain their lifestyle. Your relationship with work changes completely once you cross the $1 million threshold. And I'm not talking about immediately quitting your job, though some people do choose that path. I'm talking about working from a position of strength rather than desperation. When your investments can theoretically cover your basic living expenses, every career decision becomes a choice rather than a necessity. You can afford to walk away from toxic work environments. You can negotiate harder for better compensation because you're not desperate for the paycheck. You can take calculated risks like starting a business or switching careers because you have a financial foundation that won't disappear if things don't work out immediately. This psychological shift affects every aspect of how you approach professional opportunities. Maybe there's a job that pays less but offers better growth potential or aligns more with your values. When you have significant invested capital, you can afford to take that risk. Maybe you've always wanted to start a business but were afraid of losing steady income. Having $1 million invested doesn't eliminate the risk, but it provides a safety net that makes bold moves more feasible. The interesting thing is that this newfound confidence often leads to even better financial outcomes. People who aren't desperate tend to make better decisions. They negotiate from positions of strength. They take on projects and opportunities that align with their skills and interests rather than just taking whatever pays the bills. But perhaps the most significant change is how you think about time itself. When you're building toward that first million, every hour you don't spend earning or saving feels wasteful. You're constantly calculating the opportunity cost of leisure time. But once your capital is generating substantial income, you realize that your time has become more valuable than your immediate earning potential. This is when people start making different choices about how they spend their days. They might work fewer hours or choose work that's more personally fulfilling, even if it pays less. They might take longer vacations without worrying about lost income. They might spend more time with family or pursue hobbies that don't generate revenue but provide personal satisfaction. The $1 million threshold also unlocks access to completely different types of investment opportunities. When you have substantial capital, minimum investment requirements that would have been impossible to meet suddenly become accessible. Private equity funds, real estate syndications, business acquisition opportunities, and other high-barrier investments become options. These aren't just abstract investment strategies available to the ultra-wealthy. We're talking about opportunities that become accessible once you have $1 million foundation, and they can dramatically accelerate your wealth building beyond what most people think is possible. For instance, many real estate investment trusts and private funds require minimum investments of $50,000 to $100,000 per position. When you only have $20,000 total invested, these minimums are completely out of reach. But when you're working with $1 million portfolio, you can allocate 5 or 10% to these higher yield opportunities without putting all your eggs in one basket. The leverage opportunities also become completely different. Banks and financial institutions treat you differently when you have substantial assets. Getting approved for investment property loans becomes easier when you can show significant liquid investments as collateral. Business acquisition loans, which often require substantial down payments and proven capital reserves, suddenly become viable options. But here's where things get really interesting, and it's something that catches most new millionaires completely off guard. The psychological pressure actually increases in some unexpected ways. When you had $50,000 invested, losing 5% in a market downturn meant losing $2,500. Painful, but not devastating. When you have $1 million invested, that same 5% drop means losing $50,000. Think about that for a moment. You could lose more money in a single bad week than many people make in an entire year. Your daily portfolio fluctuations start exceeding most people's monthly salaries. This creates a completely new type of financial anxiety that you simply cannot understand until you experience it firsthand. I've watched people hit their first million and then become obsessed with checking their account balances multiple times per day. They'll refresh their portfolio apps compulsively, watching their net worth swing by tens of thousands of dollars based on market movements completely beyond their control. It's like suddenly discovering that your financial future is tied to a roller coaster that never stops moving. This is why so many people who reach the $1 million threshold start shifting their investment strategies toward more conservative approaches. They begin prioritizing capital preservation over aggressive growth. The risk tolerance that got them to $1 million often isn't the same risk tolerance that helps them keep and grow that $1 million. You start thinking about asset allocation differently when the numbers get large enough to matter. Maybe you were perfectly comfortable having 80% of your $50,000 portfolio in growth stocks. But having $800,000 in volatile investments might keep you awake at night, even if the percentage allocation is identical. This shift toward preservation isn't just emotional, it's mathematically rational. When you have $1 million invested, you're no longer trying to hit a home run. You're trying to avoid striking out. A 20% loss when you have 50,000 invested sets you back $10,000. A 20% loss on $1 million sets you back $200,000 and potentially years of progress. But here's what's fascinating about human psychology and money. Despite these new anxieties, most people who cross the $1 million threshold report feeling fundamentally more secure than they ever have in their lives. It's not because the money eliminates all uncertainty, it's because it provides a foundation that feels substantial enough to weather most storms. When you know your investments could theoretically fund your lifestyle indefinitely, it changes how you think about every other risk in your life. Job security becomes less critical when you have years of living expenses generating passive income. Health insurance gaps become less terrifying when you have substantial assets to cover unexpected medical costs. Economic recessions become less personally threatening when you own assets that historically recover and grow over time. This security creates what I call the optionality mindset. Every major life decision becomes a choice between multiple viable options, rather than a desperate attempt to avoid financial ruin. Do you want to live in an expensive city because you love the culture, or move somewhere cheaper to stretch your money further? Both become legitimate choices when your baseline financial needs are covered. Do you want to start a business that might fail, or take a steady job that might be boring? When you have substantial invested capital, you can afford to bet on yourself in ways that would be reckless without that foundation. The worst case scenario for most entrepreneurial ventures isn't poverty, it's returning to your previous lifestyle while your investments continue generating income. This optionality extends to family decisions as well. Having children becomes less financially stressful when you know your investments can help cover the increased expenses. Supporting aging parents becomes more feasible when you're not living paycheck to paycheck. Taking time off for major life events doesn't threaten your long-term financial security. The $1 million threshold also unlocks what I call the compound acceleration effect. This is where the mathematical advantage of large capital amounts becomes almost absurd. If your $1 million grows by just 8% in a given year, you've made $80,000 without any effort. That's more than many people contribute to their retirement accounts over multiple years of aggressive saving. This acceleration means that your second million often comes much faster than your first million. The first million might take 15 to 20 years of disciplined saving and investing, but once you have that foundation, the combination of continued contributions and compound growth on the larger base can cut that timeline dramatically. Here's the part that really separates millionaire investors from everyone else. They start thinking about tax optimization as a core strategy rather than an afterthought. When your investment gains are generating substantial income, the difference between paying 15% versus 25% in taxes becomes enormous. Tax loss harvesting Asset location strategies and retirement account optimization become worth the complexity because the dollar amounts involved make the effort worthwhile. The wealthy don't just have more money, they have access to better financial infrastructure. Private banking relationships, dedicated financial advisors, and sophisticated tax planning services all become economically viable when you have substantial assets to manage. These services aren't necessarily better because they're expensive, they're better because they're designed for people whose financial situations are complex enough to benefit from specialized expertise. But perhaps the most profound change that happens when you cross the $1 million threshold is how you think about legacy. When you're building your first 100,000, you're focused on your own financial security. When you have $1 million invested and it's growing faster than you can spend it, you start thinking about what happens to this wealth beyond your own lifetime. This isn't just about leaving money to children or charities. It's about understanding that you've created something that can outlive you and continue generating value for decades or even generations. Your investments become less about funding your own lifestyle and more about stewarding capital that could impact multiple lives over extended periods. This shift in thinking affects everything from your daily habits to your long-term planning. When you're accumulating your first 100,000, every dollar feels precious because progress is slow and visible. You celebrate hitting new milestones because they represent months or years of disciplined saving. But when you have $1 million generating 70,000 annually, you start thinking about money in completely different units. Instead of counting individual dollars, you start thinking in terms of months or years of financial independence. A $10,000 expense isn't devastating anymore because you know your investments will replace that money in less than 2 months. This creates what I call financial breathing room, where short-term setbacks don't trigger the same anxiety they used to. But here's where things get counterintuitive and honestly a little bit ridiculous. The more money you have invested, the more opportunities you have to make even more money with less effort. It's like the financial system has secret levels that only unlock when you reach certain thresholds, and most people have no idea these levels even exist. Take leverage, for example. When you have $20,000, banks see you as a potential risk. When you have $1 million in liquid investments, banks start seeing you as a preferred customer. Suddenly you qualify for investment property loans with better terms. You can get business lines of credit based on your asset base. You have access to margin lending that lets you borrow against your portfolio for opportunities without selling your investments. This access to cheap capital is how the wealthy really separate themselves from everyone else. They don't just save their way to wealth, they use their existing capital to acquire more capital producing assets. It's like having a key that unlocks doors most people don't even know exist. Real estate becomes a completely different game when you have substantial liquid investments. Instead of scraping together a down payment and hoping you qualify for a mortgage, you can move quickly on opportunities. Cash offers, bridge financing, and investment property acquisitions all become viable strategies when you have $1 million foundation. But perhaps the most significant change is how you think about time and opportunity cost. When you're building toward your first million, every hour spent not earning feels wasteful. You're constantly calculating whether that vacation or hobby is worth the lost income potential. Once your capital is generating substantial returns, you realize that your time might be more valuable than your immediate earning capacity. This is when people start making what seem like irrational financial decisions to outside observers. They might turn down higher paying jobs because the work environment is toxic. They might take extended time off to travel or spend with family. They might pursue passion projects that don't generate immediate income but provide personal fulfillment. From the outside, these choices look financially irresponsible. Why would someone with $1 million turn down more money? But that's exactly the point. When your basic financial needs are covered by passive income, optimization shifts from maximizing earnings to maximizing life satisfaction. The relationship with risk becomes completely inverted once you cross this threshold. When you have limited capital, every investment decision feels crucial because there's no safety net. One bad choice could set you back years, but when you have substantial invested assets, you can afford to take calculated risks because the downside is manageable. This risk tolerance paradox is fascinating to observe. The people who can most afford to lose money are often the most conservative with their core holdings, while simultaneously being more aggressive with smaller portions of their portfolio. They'll keep 80% in stable, diversified investments while using the remaining 20% for higher risk, higher reward opportunities. What's really interesting is how this affects your relationship with other people, especially around money conversations. When you're building wealth, you're eager to discuss strategies, share tips, and learn from others in similar situations. But once you have substantial assets, money conversations become more complicated. You can't really complain about investment volatility when your daily portfolio swings exceed most people's monthly salaries. You can't discuss the stress of market downturns when you know your lifestyle isn't actually threatened. You certainly can't talk about the burden of managing wealth when most people are struggling to save anything at all. This creates a weird form of social isolation that many new millionaires don't expect. The financial concerns that dominate most conversations become irrelevant to your situation, while your actual concerns sound like luxury problems to people still building their first 100,000. So there you have it. The $1,000,000 rule isn't just about reaching a number, it's about crossing into a completely different financial reality where the rules of money fundamentally change. You transform from someone who trades time for money into someone whose money works harder than most people do at their jobs. The shift from accumulator to capital owner changes everything about how you think, work, and live. If you're serious about building wealth, understanding this threshold gives you a roadmap for what's actually possible once you get there.